I'm really excited about this topic. Presentations have always been a huge part of my teaching when I teach in person. And so when I moved online a couple years ago, this was one of those kind of sticky points for me. I knew I needed to have student presentations in various ways in my courses. And I wanted to figure out the best ways to incorporate them, both for myself and for my students, and taking into consideration all of the tech questions that come with that. So I hope today will be really helpful for you. I'm going to go over a few different ways you might incorporate presentations into your teaching, some kind of lower stakes ways, and then some higher stakes. I have a lot of examples to show you, and then like Jules said, I'll take any questions that you have. We'll discuss those a little bit more toward the end of the session. So we'll start by just going over the agenda and learning objectives for this session. So just one thing in terms of tech, the only thing I would add is, and I think everyone has done this, if you can just keep yourself muted if you aren't speaking. Otherwise, there are lots of noises in the background. I have dogs and neighbors who love to come visit. And so I feel like I'm always the one who has to make sure that I'm muted. Then we're going to talk about presentations in 3 different parts. The first one is we'll be focusing on the why, when, and how of presentations. Really determining the most effective times to use presentations is a huge piece of making them an important and helpful part of your class. The second part, we'll talk about developing the actual task. So those directions that you give to students in Canvas to help them understand what they need to be doing in terms of both the content and the format of their presentations. Part 3 will be facilitation. So presentation day happens. What does that look like for you? And then we'll do the debrief and address any of your questions. So the objectives that I have for this session, 1, we're going to identify reasons for having students present. 2, we're going to look at qualities of an effective presentation task. 3, we'll identify strategies for facilitating synchronous student presentations. We'll also look at strategies for asynchronous presentations, because not all presentations actually need to happen during a live Zoom session. And then we'll play around with some digital tools, or I'll show you some, model some, that can be really helpful when you are doing student presentations. The focus of this particular session is not to go deep into the tech side of things, although I'll provide some guidelines for you and some kind of point you in some directions for some additional tech support, but more to focus on the pedagogical side. Okay, so I want to start with just a question for the group, and please feel free to just jump in, but using your audio, you don't have to type in the chat. But I want to know some of the reasons why you use presentations in your teaching. So whether that's in person or online, why do you think that they're helpful in your course?
Engage learners.
Engage learners, great. Why else do you include presentations? Because they can take a lot of work. I mean, the day of the presentations is great, right? It can feel like a breeze, but it can be a lot of work on the front end. So why do we do it?
I think it helps prepare them for the future too, because they're going to be working with collaborative groups in most workplaces.
Great. And so definitely knowing the profession that a lot of our graduates are going into. So like Jules was saying, I teach English education classes. So almost all of my students are going to be teachers. Being able to collaborate with other people and to speak about content and information to them and make that clear is a really important part of preparing them for that profession. Great. Maybe one more reason why we use presentations?
Well, in my class, we're going to have case conferences where students will present a client case and discuss, the needs and the services that the client needs.
Great, great. Anything with a case study, developing a case, presentations are a great use or a great help when you're actually, having students talk about and analyze those cases. Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Megan. I put it in the chat. This is Sharon. One of the key things for public speaking is to have the accountability or make sure that I'm aligned to different learning styles. So very good presentations have been a positive, not just public speaking, but other things. It helps to, like I said, accommodate the learning styles and to supplement, hopefully, the return on investment of what we're looking for in terms of getting the learning objectives accomplished. Sorry, so
Great.
long-winded there.
No, that's wonderful. And I think one of the things you're talking about are the ways that we differentiate our instruction. So if we are only allowing students to show us what they know through writing, there are a host of students who would show us much more fully their knowledge and their understanding of content matter if we allow them to do it verbally through a presentation. And so allowing for those times for students to share what they know is really important.
Megan, you do have a lot of comments actually in the chat box real quick. And so I'll just run through some of them really quickly to add on to the end of this, this part one here, the why, when, and how. We have people talking about team presentations, building teamwork skills, gaining professional presentation and speaking skills, student ownership, practice, basically live practice, confirming that they've actually picked up on the knowledge and skills that they are supposed to be picking up in the class. Let's see what else we've got here. I like for students to also practice thinking on their feet during a Q&A session. So all of these things that we're hearing about in the chat, developing an appreciation for the work that goes into learning, helping students through a logical thought process on the topic. This is active engagement. It's active learning. It's active learning here in the brain, and it's active learning and engaging with other students.
Great, thank you. So I'll just put a few more whys up here, and I won't go through all of these, but two that I was hearing, that idea of building community. I think, especially if we're teaching solely online, sometimes it can feel really challenging to build community with our students. And by allowing them to do presentations, even if they are independent presentations, not small group presentations, we can still build that community with our students. The other one that I don't think I heard, but it kind of touches on a lot of the comments that were made, is that application of content knowledge. So a lot of times when we've moved to a presentation, we're moving past the regurgitation of this is the information that I've learned. And instead we're having students apply that information that you've provided them to a host of different areas. And that's why we want them to present, because those presentations ideally should be sharing lots of different information and not just repeating information that they've already heard. So I keep moving this around. So when should you have students present is one really important thing to think about too. So one time that you might have them present is when you want to assess their knowledge of course content. So like we were talking about, how writing is one way that we assess. We also have exams. Presentations are just another form of assessment. It can also be to assess students' ability to apply that course content like we were talking about, to solve problems, kind of like the cases that we have students analyze, to draw conclusions, make inferences, all of the great Bloom's taxonomy words here. When there are a number of possible or acceptable topics or applications of content. And this one's an important one. If we're going to take the time to present, students should be sharing information that is new or unfamiliar to their peers. We don't want them all coming into a presentation and talking about the same topic. So thinking strategically about, when am I having students apply our knowledge from the class to something that is going to be different or new for the rest of the students is an important step in this thought process. And last but not least, to support students in teaching and learning from one another. Our students are sick of hearing from us, especially when it's online. They've listened to screencasts of me talking. They've seen videos of me introducing content. And then they come to our live sessions and they hear me talk again. So moving ourselves out of the way and providing that time for students to learn from one another is really important. Okay. So there are two main presentation types, so the how of this. We can either have synchronous presentations or asynchronous. For our synchronous presentations, you're going to have to think about how many students you have in a class, how many are coming to your synchronous sessions, if you are even having synchronous sessions. So there's a lot of things to think about there. But largely these happen during a shared live class time. It can either be in person or it could be over Zoom like we're doing today. These synchronous sessions allow students to view and respond to all peers' work during class time. So if you have smaller groups of students, or you know that you have a topic that everyone needs to hear about, a synchronous session can be really a good choice here. It allows for immediate peer interaction and verbal response. So even if you're having kind of more low stakes presentation, maybe students are talking about a work in progress, or they're talking through a thought process, such as analyzing a case, then they're able to get that immediate response during the synchronous session. And then last, it does require you to think very specifically about your time limitations and to hold students to those time limitations. So time is always a challenge in teaching, but particularly when we are having students present synchronously. For asynchronous presentations, these can be shared outside of class time. We can use Canvas for this, and I'm going to show you some examples in just a moment. They allow students to view and respond to just selected peers' work. So if you know that students don't need to see everybody's stuff, or if you have 100 students in your class, then an asynchronous presentation may be a smarter choice here. They do allow for recorded, verbal, or written peer responses. So Canvas is terrific. Students can record videos or just audio of response feedback. So you can still kind of build in that community aspect and that interrelationship, but it might not happen live. And then this also kind of gets you around the time limitations. Of course, we're still going to address time and tell our students how much time we want them to spend on their presentations, but we're not so stuck in terms of having to monitor that time like we are during a live synchronous session. All right, so we'll move on to part 2. And this is developing the task. And so I'll go through 4 main components that a strong presentation task should have. And then I'm going to show you 2 different examples. One is a synchronous presentation task that I've developed in Canvas, and one is an asynchronous presentation task. So you can see what it looks like from the student perspective. So the 4 most important things to include in any kind of prompt or set of directions, first is to set the clear and specific context. And as simple as it may seem, I think this is the one that we skip most often, especially online. When we're introducing things in person, it comes naturally. We talk about, we've done this, and now we're going to do this, and you're going to present in this way. We have to do that online as well. So why are you having students present? Why is this topic important? What information are you wanting them to apply and to think about as they come to the presentation? 2, indicate what students are going to explain or describe. This can go into a lot of depth, or it can be just a general overview to get you started. But generally, what are students doing? Then pointing to the way of an appropriate response. And I find that this one too is one that requires a good amount of specificity, especially online. These are those questions that come up organically when we're in person, and online we want to field a lot of emails. And so one way to do that is to provide as much detail as you can up front. So you want to provide information about the content, but you also want to think about all of the other aspects. So the format, the style, the timing of the presentation. And then last but not least, providing information about when, where, and how students will share their presentations. Will this be a live synchronous presentation? Will it be asynchronous? Will they have 10 minutes to present and 5 minutes for Q&A afterwards? What are you expecting in terms of seeing that final product? I like to think of this when we assign a paper. We tell them usually a word count or a number of pages. Giving them a time limitation is the equivalent of that for a presentation. It gives them an idea of how in depth to go and what you're looking for overall. So I'm going to share 2 examples with you. So I'm just going to switch screens. And we'll start with this one. Okay, so this is an example of a small group project and presentation that the students will have worked on before coming to a live session. So this is a bigger assessment in my class. So we start with the context here. So I just have the overview. In this particular task, students have been reading young adult novels in small groups, and they're thinking about how an English teacher might go about teaching this young adult novel from a critical literacies perspective. So that's all jumble from my own teaching, but providing an overview of, this is what we've been talking about so far, and I expect you to be thinking about critical literacies as you approach this task. Then we move into step 2, which is telling them what they're doing. So what are we doing? So these projects had 3 components, and I have students in groups of 3 so that there are really clear tasks for each person in the group. I don't tell them that they have to divide these tasks up, that one person takes on the book talk and one person takes on the critical analysis. I let them make those decisions on their own, but it is an easy way to divide up tasks when our students are remote and they're far away from each other. And so they can see that they have these 3 components they need to decide on in their group. Then I have an idea of what it should look like. So I have some tools for them to use here. I like for my students to try out lots of different tools. It works within my content area. That's an important part of the learning objective. That may not make sense for yours. You may just want to tell them one tool to use and that's it. But for my students, I want them to do things like make an infographic or create a video. They need to learn those tools. So they have some idea of what they should be using in order to put together their project and their presentation. And then I go into detail. So for the book talk, these are all the specific things I expect to see in that part of the presentation. For the critical analysis, we have these 4 tasks. For the pedagogical approach, there's this section here. So really clear ideas of what they need to do. And then we have submission information. So for this one, students will be presenting during our live session, our live class session, but I want everything submitted ahead of time. So our live sessions are at 6 o'clock on Wednesdays. So I ask them to submit any links to any materials they're going to use in those presentations by 5:30. There are a few reasons that I do this. One is because I prefer to share my screen rather than having all of my students share their screens. It saves time on my end, and it saves issues with technology on the student end. And so if I have access to all of the materials they're going to use for their presentations ahead of time, I have them ready to go for our live session. We don't have to fool with that during this session. The other part is accountability. I don't want students rushing in at the last minute, trying to find the link that they need, and not having things complete. So if it's due before the session, I can ensure that it's done and we can jump right in and not waste time during our live session. All of this is also communicated through the rubric. So you can see that the rubric, it matches the different components that have been in the instructions, the different steps of the rubric, or the different criteria of the rubric all match all of the directions that were given. So students have all of this information. They have a very clear sense of what they're doing and how they're going to submit it way in advance of the actual live session where they do it. Then I can show you, I'll show you an example of an independent asynchronous presentation. So for this task, again, we have the context here. All of my students are researching a different digital tool that they could use as an English language arts teacher to improve their teaching. So I've provided all of that context here. Then what they're doing, and again, this is independently, they're choosing a tool that they're less familiar with, that would be new to them and they'd like to try out. They explore and play with the tool, learn about it, what does it do, get ideas for applying it to teaching. And then they teach us. And so this is the presentation component. So all of these students are required to develop a 15-minute screencast, and it can be a little bit less than that's fine, to showcase their tool. And so first I'll talk about the technology and then the content. So for the technology, I recommend that they use Kaltura, which they already have access to in Canvas. Many instructors were used to using Kaltura. It looks the same for students to be able to use it. The directions are the same. What Kaltura allows students to do is to record either just a video of their face talking, the actual screen that they have up, so like the PowerPoint, or a combination of both, the PowerPoint and their face. And so they can provide a lot of information. It's just like doing a presentation with a Google Slide presentation tool in person or live. So they would record that, their presentation using Kaltura. The content of the presentations is here. I'm expecting them to give me a gist. What is the tool that you're telling us about? Do a deep dive, tell us a little bit more about how it could be used and why it's good for student learning, and then to provide a teaching tip. So how would you actually use this in a classroom with students? Then the sharing part is the unique part here when you're doing asynchronous. So you've had your students record their Kaltura video. Where does it go from here? This is one of those projects where everybody should be presenting on different things. So I want people to have access to all of these presentations in my class. So what I have students do is to share their screencast to a discussion board. And you can see they have 3 deadlines here. First, they share a link to their screencast to the discussion board with a really brief statement overview of their tool. Then they have about a week to choose 2 other peers in their class. And I do choice. Sometimes it's better to assign just to make sure everybody has their video viewed. But I have them find 2 other peers and to watch their screencast and then post a response or a question, but generally starting a discussion about that screencast to the discussion board. And then the person who initially shared the screencast is responsible for monitoring that discussion. So they should be checking back in, responding to their peers when they have questions or ideas, but generally just facilitating that discussion around the screencast. So from a timing perspective, this takes no time out of my synchronous live sessions that are already so limited. And it's also not requiring all 30 of my students or 40 of my students to watch 40 different presentations. Instead of limited to their time, they're choosing the 2 that are on tools that might be effective for them, focusing on those presentations, and then having a discussion around them. So those are 2 examples of 2 different types of presentation tasks that you can give students. I try to make everything just as clear as possible and follow the same kind of format on all of my pages so that students know what they're looking for. And then try to, as much as possible, imagine what their questions are going to be before they start looking over the tool. All right, so we'll move on to part 3. So facilitating presentations online, honestly, it looks a lot like it does in person. And I think the biggest question most of us wrestle with when we're doing presentations in class is how do we hold the whole class accountable? One of the things, and any of you that I've worked with before know that my biggest struggle in online teaching is this inability to read the room. When I'm doing presentations, having presentations in class face-to-face, I can see who's not paying attention. But when it's online, it's a little bit more challenging. So I found I've really had to structure the time in order to make sure students are really held accountable for being an audience member. So a few things first, and then we'll go through the expectations. So first, you've got to provide really clear expectations for student presentations and any necessary links ahead of time. So if you need them contributing to a Google Slide presentation, which I'll show you that in just a second, provide all of that ahead. Requiring all student work to be submitted ahead of time. We talked about that a few minutes ago. Avoiding having to change presenters for screen sharing. This is a personal preference of mine. I always feel under the gun when I'm teaching synchronously. I feel like I run out of time really quickly. And so one of the ways I try to address that is to not have students do the screen share for me to do it. But if you're working with advanced students, or if you have a smaller class, or you do a lot of presentations, by all means, you can give your students presenter rights in Zoom, and they can share their screen just like I am today. And then the most important, and this is the one we'll move into in just a second, is communicating clear expectations for the presenters, like we've been talking about, but also the audience members and yourself. So making it clear to everyone who's there what you will be doing as the instructor during this presentation time. So I'm going to talk about, before we get into those expectations, low stakes synchronous presentations, and then a more high stakes synchronous presentation, and going over just the procedures of what that looks like. So for the low stakes synchronous presentation, this is probably not the best term for it, but basically what I mean by that is this is not something that students have done a lot of preparation for ahead of time. This might be one of those, like, I just want students sharing information during class, so I'm not the one doing it. So for this, you would provide students with access to a shared Google Slide presentation. I'm going to show you one in just a moment, where students will be able to contribute to that slide presentation. In order to do this, they will need editing privileges, so you'll just need to make sure you click that when you are sharing the Google Slide. Then you want to provide instructions for the slide contributions. What are you wanting your students to add to the slide? Provides time for students to contribute to the slides, and this could be done ahead of time before a live session, or this is a great chance to use breakout rooms in Zoom or in WebEx for students to work in small groups to contribute to a slide presentation. And then you want to have students present the contents of their slides to the whole group. And this usually includes choosing a spokesperson. So if you have students in groups of 4 or 5, you don't want every person in each group talking. They should choose one person, or you could choose them to be the spokesperson during that time. One of the ways that I use this most often is when I have a lot of reading to assign. So if I know for instance, there's 1 week in my course and I need everyone to have the information from chapters 7 through 10 of the book, in addition to some other readings. But I don't necessarily need everybody reading chapters 7 through 10. I just need them to get the main takeaways. So how I use this presentation format here is to assign small groups to different chapters that they will have read before they come into our live session. And then during the live session, I move them into their breakout rooms with those people who read the same chapter as them, and they populate a slide in our shared Google Slide presentation with the main takeaways from that chapter. So then once they present on those to the rest of the class, everyone in the class has the main information from those readings that they need. So it's a good time saver, and it also moves me out of the picture and puts students more in the fore of teaching. I'm going to show you, and I'm happy, Jules, too, to share any of these with you at the end of the session. That might be helpful. Let me pull up.
We can do a follow-up email, Megan, with resources in it. Does that sound good?
Great. Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
Okay, so this is an example of a presentation, a Google Slide presentation I would share with my students either ahead of time or just once we get started in the live session. So everyone would have access to this link. You can share it in the chat box. You could put it on Canvas for students to access. I usually just do the chat because I'm usually running last minute, and so I have it done just right before the session starts. So what I have are directions for them. I would move them into breakout groups. They would have 10 minutes to introduce themselves, to talk about the main points from the reading, and then I tell them specifically what I want on each slide, or the slide that they're developing as a group. What are 5 takeaways, and what's one open-ended discussion you could pose, and then that directive there to identify one spokesperson for the group. I then include the same information every time about how to add a slide. Most students do know how to add a slide to a presentation at this point, but if they don't, these directions are here for them, including screenshots, so they can see exactly how to add a slide. So by the end of their 10-minute work session in their breakout groups, I would have my initial slides that I've put in here, but then also all of the slides that each group has added with their information. So then everyone in the class has this as a tool to refer back to. These are notes that they can have on the chapters that they haven't read. And then we'll also use this to discuss the readings in our whole class session as well. So like I said, this is a more low stakes. It's not something they're doing ahead of time necessarily. You could have them do it ahead of time, but this is just a good way to get through information sometimes. All right, so we're going to move in and talk about expectations for the instructors, students, and the audience members. The expectations are generally the same for whether you're teaching an asynchronous or synchronous, if you're doing presentations either way. So for synchronous presentations, Your expectations for the presenter, again, to submit the information that they need ahead of time, anything they're going to use for the presentation itself. They should be adhering to time limitations. I make this part of my rubric because students are they won't practice, and so they'll be far under or they'll be far over the limit. And I really hate that moment when I have to cut them off when they're over. So I do make that part of the rubric. I find that helps them to take the time limitations seriously. I do reiterate to them the importance of practicing. And I think this is something that all of us have to reiterate, that a presentation, just like any other assessment that we have in our class, is important, that there is preparation that needs to go in ahead of time. And it is not just about making a visual, but instead practicing how you're going to explain that information that you're sharing with your group or with the class. I also expect them to listen, take notes, and respond when the audience shares feedback. The feedback loop is really important to me between the audience and the presenter. If I'm taking class time to have students present, then it is important that everyone is getting something from that. So whether that's feedback on the format of the presentation, the style of the presentation, or the content, feedback is important. I also have clear expectations for the audience. So I ask them, usually very specifically, I tell them to write down a question and a comment for each presenter. And they may or may not share for every presenter. We usually don't have time for everyone to share feedback after every presenter, but at least everyone should have something written down. That way, when it does come time to have some discussion or Q&A after a presenter, if you have crickets, you can just call on students because they should have written down a question or a comment during the presentation anyways. You know, everyone should have something to say. They are also expected to share questions or comments following the presentation. I often ask them to use the rubric criteria to help them, to guide them through their feedback. There's a reason there's a rubric. They get the rubric ahead of time. And so that's a good way to guide the criteria of their feedback. And then KWL charts are a pretty common tool across content areas. Sometimes they can be effective, sometimes not, just depends on the content, but having students record before the session or the presentation gets started, what do they already know about that topic? What are some things they hope to learn when they listen to the students present? And then afterwards, what have they learned after hearing the presentations? And so this may be, they might not complete a KWL for every single presenter, but instead for the whole of presentations. So if they are sitting through an hour of presentations, you know, tracking that information across the whole hour. The additional component that you can add to that KWL is a where would I go to find that information. So if there's things that they didn't learn that they wanted to know more about, where can they go to learn more? So having that kind of follow-up task after the presentations, depending again on what your purpose of your presentations is and what you're teaching, that can be an important step. And then communicating clear expectations for the instructor. So keeping time. Like I've said, giving specific questions and topics to audience members to consider. So are you wanting them to really focus on the content, on ways to improve, on things that people did well? What are some directives that you can provide? And then facilitating discussions and constantly reminding students of the expectations. We don't typically have students present regularly in our classes. It's usually just a few times a semester, so they do need those reminders quite often. For facilitating asynchronous presentations, like I said, the pointers aren't all that different. Again, it's just a lot of the extra footwork happens on the front end. So setting up that discussion board where you want people to share their presentations, telling them how to share their presentation, and what kinds of, you know, how you're going to complete that feedback loop again by having students view and actually respond to the presentations that are completed and shared by their peers. All right, so those are the main things that I have to share. I'm really happy to talk through any of the tech side of things, or to show more examples, or just address all of the questions that you've developed as we've been sitting here. I appreciate you listening to me talk for so long. I think most of us find it uncomfortable to just spew information, but sometimes that's